Welcome to our continuing series of virtual voices, which focuses on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you for your letters and comments. We very much appreciate receiving them. Our speaker today is Farri Gaba, who is the research assistant at MIT Center for Transportation and Logistics. His current research focuses on drone delivery policies. He is also with youth representative on our board of directors. Over to you, Farri.
Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. It's good to see some familiar names and faces, and thanks, Dr. Durbak, for having me. So I guess just to kick it off a little bit, let's discuss what we're here to talk about, which is drone delivery, but more importantly, what drone delivery means for society. So past the hype of this new technology, what we call drone delivery. And so this is not something that I think a lot of people are aware of, that may be coming very soon to societies around the world and cities around the world. So this is very much what my research focuses on, is sort of understanding what are the negative impacts of new technologies. And in this case, what are the negative impacts of deploying drone delivery around the world? And so I think that begs the question, what is a drone and what are their use cases? And I've mentioned drone delivery specifically. Why am I talking about drone delivery? So a drone in many ways it takes a lot of different forms, right? It's like we know a drone historically to be the military drone that the US Air Force uses around the world, and it's a large airplane-like thing. That was the first incarnation of a drone, but actually over time it evolved to be something much smaller, and it actually was still used in the military. Small helicopter-like vehicles that were aerial, autonomously flown, remote controlled, and it could go around the world and capture footage and these sorts of things. Drones jumped the military to commercial or private use case in the last 20 years or so. And they really fill three roles in today's societies. I mean, the first one is the recreational drone. So like lots of kids or young adults would buy a drone and use it recreationally, fly, take pictures, take videos of themselves doing stunts. That's one use case. The other major use case that we're seeing a lot today is the commercial use case. And that really falls into the buckets of delivery and logistics, which is what I'm really doing my research on and what we're going to talk about today. But also lots of other applications, like used in construction, used in agriculture, for seeding crops, for land use mapping, that sort of thing. It's used in utility companies to trace or to track construction efforts in rural areas like telephone lines or these sorts of things. It's used in filming and entertainment. So anytime that we ever used a helicopter to film something, a drone can now do exactly the same job, but much more efficiently. So that's another use case for drones. There are lots of commercial applications, but there are also some public applications. Like, for instance, the police have now started using drones in different countries to track criminals when they're in a pursuit, to surveillance in the sense of surveilling populations, surveilling strikes, surveilling protests, these sorts of things. And obviously what we've seen in recent days is using facial recognition software on these drones to track people. So these are the sorts of use cases that drones are common today. With that said, I focus on the impact of drone delivery. Now, why do I care about drone delivery so much? Because I think that's where that is the real initiator of large amounts of drones flying in our major cities between now and 2050. And so all the other use cases I've mentioned will be niche use cases in rural areas or specific locations. But drone delivery will be ubiquitous. It'll fly across our cities day in, day out, on the hour. And I think that has real implications for cities, our societies, and the quality of life that we would expect to see in our cities. And so let's talk about what I mean by drone delivery. And first of all, why are drones even being considered in these sorts of settings? The real thing to think about when it comes to companies like Amazon, UPS, DHL, FedEx, when they propel the idea of drones being used to deliver packages or consumer goods, is almost fourfold. The first reason is that drones are technically more sustainable than the traditional delivery truck. And so we've always seen the big brown UPS van that goes around and delivers packages in our cities. Drones on a life cycle analysis, including the cost of building the battery, throwing away the battery, and all the structural components of the drone, they will emit less CO2 than, let's say, a typical delivery van. So what does that mean is that if we can outsource some of our delivery efforts to drones, the company as a whole, Amazon, UPS, they can emit lower amounts of CO2. So that's obviously a positive thing, right? But at the same time, drones are good for a bunch of other reasons. Lots of consumers nowadays have required or have expected 1 hour or 2 hour delivery times, which is obviously something that it's very hard for these companies to meet with the traditional delivery mode of transport, which is having a big van, having lots of packages in that van, and delivering throughout the day. That's very hard to manage for these big companies. So drones offer that opportunity for them to serve individual clients or customers within very short time constraints, but still meeting the expectations of the customer. The last real point why drones are useful and interesting for last mile delivery companies is that they increase access. And what I mean by this is that a lot of people don't realize this, but lots of people in rural areas or in countries that don't have very robust or comprehensive or developed road networks, lots of customers in rural areas aren't served at the same service level as you expect in a city. And that's kind of intuitive, right? Like we live in New York, we expect to be served in 1 hour or 2 hours. We live somewhere in the rural areas, and we expect 2 or 3 day service times. Now, Amazon, UPS, these sorts of people, these sorts of companies are trying to serve those customers in those rural areas as well as possible. And there are often customers in these rural areas that aren't served at all. And so using a drone, which is in many ways a disposable vehicle that you can place and move around wherever need be, can hopefully increase access or increase their, in real terms, addressable market for customers in the rural areas. So these are the reasons why drones are attractive for last mile delivery. What I would say is what's important from a societal perspective about last mile delivery. Last mile delivery, as I hope is clear, is basically the concept of delivering goods and packages into major cities. And this has been a thing that's been happening for a while, but in the last 20 years, as e-commerce exploded, last mile delivery has become more and more of a potent issue. It's been potent because it contributes to urban congestion. So a lot of big trucks causing a lot of traffic. It contributes to the CO2 emissions, which is something we've talked about. And it contributes to UPS's and Amazon's bottom line. And so these are all the things, that's why drones are attractive from both the societal and the company's perspective. But I'm here today, or at least part of my research is to determine, is that really the case? Like, do societies really want drones? And what should we be worried about? Because in the last 20 years, we've seen lots of new technologies being deployed, but these technologies have not always been to the betterment of society. And so some of the things that I work on at MIT are basically that not all technologies are net positive on society. And I personally think drones are one of those technologies. And so that begs the question that I stated in my, I guess, the title prompt, which is, what do drones mean for society? So let's just imagine the scenario where every day, let's say we're in 2050 or 2040, every day drones will be launched and retrieved across our cities on the hour or every 30 minutes, delivering packages to your neighbor, to yourself, to people all around the city. These will be individual trips carrying a single package because that's all the drones can carry. And so there'll be lots of trips. On average, a company like Amazon or UPS could serve around 30,000 packages in a city in one day. That's like an average in a large city. A proportion of those are servable by drone because they're small enough or that sort of thing. So that's already a large number of packages being served by drone. If we assume that every package has to be served once, that's, let's say, 5,000 or 10,000 flights a day for drones, and that's a lot of drones over a city in a short period of time. And so, what does this mean for our quality of life? There are lots of key issues that I want to mention here, but I just want to bring up a couple of the most important ones. The first one is privacy. So this is something that drones are notoriously known for, is if a drone is flying overhead and it's carrying a package, it will need to have cameras on board to avoid birds, to avoid other airplanes, to avoid other drones. It'll also need to have cameras to figure out where to land. It's always going to be scanning the ground for the symbol that says, this is your customer, you need to land here. But in doing that, the camera will always be on. Does that mean that it can track or it can collect data on whatever it flies over as well? Does that mean that if it captures a picture of your house, does it have rights to that picture? Can it sell that picture later on? We know that satellite companies are now predicting the size of houses, the number of cars you may own, and therefore your wealth and your income based on images from satellites. And they do that very commonly for places like Walmart and Target. They predict their earnings and revenues based on the number of cars in their car park. So this is not like beyond the wit of man to realize that drones could do something similar as well. This is obviously an issue because one, the FAA doesn't have real regulations on aerial privacy because it's never been an issue until now. But two, people don't realize the risk that they're at until it comes. And that's kind of been the same with social media and other things, is that these are technologies that have been deployed, but we were never aware of the issues until we suffer the repercussions. So drones and privacy, that's one key issue. The other key issue is noise. Now, noise may not seem like a big issue because our current understanding of noise is commercial aircraft and helicopters, which fly over very rarely, and they're loud, yes, but we only hear them once a day or once a couple of days. Drones will be much higher pitched, much more frequent, and much lower to the ground. And those three things combined will mean that I think drones will be very annoying for lots of people in the city. Now, this issue, noise, combined with the specter of privacy breaches or the specter of Big Brother where privacy is being breached all the time, could also mean that people intervene against drones if they can. And what I mean by this is there have been already incidents of people trying to shoot down a drone. And now what does that mean for society? It means huge liability issues for the drone companies, but also for the people that are doing this intervening, putting other people in society at risk. And the worst thing that we want is a resistance to these sort of operations that divide society. The last issue that I think is important is what I call the discrimination of service levels. Now, this is not an obvious issue until you think about it and you think, oh wow, that could be something to think about. Drones are a technology not for the everyday American or for the average citizen. They're technology, especially in the early days, for the wealthy percentage of our population. And the reason I say that is because drones are predominantly being introduced to increase the service level of our consumer goods being delivered to us by Amazon. Yes. So in cities, we can expect people to pay more for half an hour delivery by drone. if drones are used in rural areas to give people more access, what happens when someone in a rural area is willing to pay $15 to get a delivery by drone, and someone, his next door neighbor or her next door neighbor, is not able to afford that? That's not so much of an issue if you're getting delivered toys or toothbrushes or these sorts of consumer goods that are there to be consumed. But the moment these deliveries become tied to your quality of life or lifeline related goods like medicine, like school textbooks, for instance, like these sorts of things that have direct impact on your quality of life and opportunity of life, that comes to beg the question, are we dividing society along wealth gaps or wealth divides and exacerbating that divide? And so this is not something that I think many people think about when it comes to drones, but we can see it happening in other new technologies as well. So for instance, very advanced cancer therapy that costs a lot of money. Certain people can pay for that, certain people can't. And that draws a line, whether we like it or not, between certain wealth gaps in our society. The same will come for, this is very far-fetched, but anti-aging medicine. Like, we don't know if that exists yet. People are studying it in San Francisco. But that will also have the risk of bringing wealth into the equation of technology. Technology becomes a propellant for the wealthy rather than a service for a net positive service for all. And that's something that drones run the risk of doing as well in the next couple of years. And so these are the sorts of issues that could be brought onto the fore when drones are deployed. I'm going to stop there and ask if anyone has any questions. Otherwise, I think I could spend some time discussing some possible solutions to these issues.
Farri, that was actually excellent, and you brought in very, very relevant and important points. And I have about 20 questions so far. And the question is, do you think drones can displace traditional means of warfare? And how will this affect society? It's a very interesting question.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, it will. They will, and they already are. I know people working in research that are designing drone swarms. And so what this is that there are 20 or 30 drones, and there's always one lead drone inside the middle of the pack. And a military officer or someone sitting in a safe house in the US can operate a drone somewhere around the world. And this drone, they operate the drone in the middle, and they fly that drone, and all the other drones follow, if that makes sense. And they're all armed. They're all armed with cameras, with any form of small ammunition, these sorts of things. They can often be strapped with explosives, and they act as their own, with lack of a better word, kamikaze vehicle. The moment that middle drone, the head drone, gets shot down, another drone takes its place. And so these are the sorts of applications that we could expect to see. Now, what does this mean for society? Huge implications. What constitutes crimes against humanity when it's not you doing it? It's an autonomous drone. It's pre-programmed. Is it the drone? Is it the software? Is it the person who designed the software? Is it the person who initiated the military exercise? This is something that autonomous warfare beyond drones has brought to the fore, is when it comes to predator drones, the large aircraft that we see, comes to missile launches, that comes to autonomous aircraft that will soon be launched rather than our current fighter jets. These are the sorts of things that people will have to think about. And it really comes down to, are the negative externalities of society worse than the positive effects for the country doing the warfare? And so the US in particular will have to think about, where do its values stand with regards to the risk it imposes on societies? But it's a big question, and I'm sorry I don't have more information, but definitely something to be cognizant of.
The next question is it difficult to introduce drone delivery on a permanent basis within a particular country. But I did want to mention that what you're talking about, warfare and drones, is really very, very frightening when you think about that, because that means that anybody can use them to basically deliver a bomb, a small bomb, almost any place. Had this ready,
Yeah,
but anyway.
absolutely.
Can you, this is a question for you about the delivery.
Sure. I'd say a lot of people ask me a similar question, which is, what date do you expect to see drones being delivered across different countries? And I always say that there is no expected date. What we are going to see is gradual implementation of drones. The reason why is that lots of countries are now a lot more skeptical of these new technologies than previously. So for social media, we didn't care. We said, sure, like it can't be harmful. Go ahead, like launch your service. And we almost still do that with the most recent technologies, like platforms like TikTok and Clubhouse recently. These sorts of things. Drones. Drones, because they're hardware based and they're tangible and people can see them and hold them. People are a lot more aware, and governments are a lot more aware of what the negative consequences will be. And so, in answering that question, I would say I wouldn't expect to see an on-off switch where drones are automatically launched or automatically introduced, or vice versa, are never introduced. I think it'll be pockets of use cases where the customers are willing to pay the extra fee for a higher level service. The regulations are such that the government allows drone operations over certain neighborhoods and over certain municipalities. And that's sort of the level of service we expect. And that's kind of what we're seeing already, is that pockets of service that will become more prevalent, but not ubiquitous.
This is another question. Today, the whole world has experienced a surge of the epidemic of COVID. In your opinion, is it possible to improve drones so they can deliver heavier goods? And would the use of drones remain relevant after the pandemic? Well, the third part you answered already, but the first and second.
Yeah. Can drones be made to carry heavier goods? Yes. Will they be? Maybe not, because that incurs larger risks with larger vehicles, larger batteries, larger goods, payloads. And that potentially crosses lines when it comes to regulation, because where do you draw the line between a small drone and a commercial aircraft flying at 40 meters above your head, right? So I think there'll come a time where they'll draw a line and there'll be a ceiling of service in terms of the size of the drone that we can expect to see. Just because if that drone falls out of the sky, we don't want it to be 50 kilograms heavy. What I would say is that, can they be used for things like like medicinal delivery and these sorts of things? Yes and no. Like that was how they were first introduced, and that's how they're first being tested. Delivering blood, delivering organs, delivering medicine, especially in places like Rwanda with zipline, these sorts of operations. When it comes to COVID, because of the refrigeration requirements for vaccines, drones are not capable of serving that demand because they can't carry the cold storage stuff on board. And the flight over, let's say 10, 15-minute flights between locations is too long to maintain the temperature for most of the vaccines that we have available. The smaller vaccines, yes, like Johnson & Johnson and are the ones that don't need refrigeration, they can be delivered. But when it comes to our COVID rollout, because we're trying to inoculate so many people at such a short period of time, drones don't fit that service well. They fit like short-term sporadic service that people need to pay for or need to have in like emergency. So blood donorship and transport is like the perfect use case for it. But when it comes to more standardized drone delivery of COVID vaccines, I don't think it's going to happen.
That's excellent point. Now, this is another question. Is there an enormous negative impact for the environment, wildlife, due to noise, wasting of energy and resources?
That's a very good question, and I think a very good, like a high level understanding of the problem. Yeah, absolutely. It's fantastic. I think let's talk about the small, like let's talk about the focused problem first, and then we'll expand out to like the higher level that you just asked. When drones are used, they put wildlife at risk because there will definitely be a likelihood of bird strikes because drones fly at the same altitude as birds most of the time over cities. And they will be as ubiquitous as they can be for the companies that deploy them, putting more wildlife in cities at risk. What does this mean for our cities? Well, likely that birds will try and avoid the cities if possible. We'll see more drones flying over our cities, less birds. And that's, I think, a direct correlation. Another thing about the environment is that drones are electrically powered, and because of that, they have lithium-ion batteries. Now, there have been lots of studies at places like MIT and elsewhere of the life cycle analysis of these lithium-ion batteries and what they do to the environment when we extract the materials or the minerals that we require and when we throw them away at the end of the day. They're very hard to recycle because the chemical reaction is such that deposits are formed and it's more expensive to recycle than it is to just build a new one. And so drones only have a lifespan, or at least the batteries only have a lifespan of a couple of years, 4 or 5 years, as you'd expect on your smartphone, for instance. And so what happens to your smartphone battery or your drone battery when it's done? It gets thrown away. And I've never done that research onto what happens on a life cycle analysis if like the negative impacts of the disposal on the environment of the disposal of the drone is worse than the net positive impact of serving our customers more sustainably. But that's something definitely we need to think about, and not a simple answer.
Is there a maximum distance where drones can fly without losing connection?
Yeah, great question. Losing connection? No, because drones will likely be connected to the internet just as our phones are. And as long as they're in the city and they have access to cell towers, they will also have access to connectivity. And so I'd say, to answer your question directly, an operating range of 30 or 40 miles is probably acceptable for drones, which is a lot, right? And 30 to 40 miles is beyond the visual line of sight. So we won't be able to see our drone when we operate it, or when Amazon or UPS launches their drone. They'll have one person in a drone hub controlling their fleet of drones, just pointing where they should go, and the drones will do the work themselves, connected to the internet, connected to the controller. Drones do have a maximum range, however, and that maximum range is dependent on how much they're carrying, but also the size of the battery they're carrying. And those batteries, one, they deteriorate over time, but two, they're not that great. Like the max range that we get out of a drone is 20, 30 miles at best. And that's with a very good drone, with a very lightweight payload. What this comes to say is that although there's not going to be a risk that drones fall from the sky because they run out of battery, this is something that definitely limits drones. And so that comes back to my other point about discrimination of service levels, is that if our drone can't reach the most far-flung rural areas, are they just not served those customers? Do they just not have access to the textbooks and to the medical supplies that all the other people in the city have access to? If there's no internet in that area, does that mean they're not served? These are things that I think the government should step in and think about. Do these services have a positive impact on society beyond the profit line for the companies? If so, we should step in to make this service more equitable for society.
Another question: how do the drones work in adverse conditions, bad weather, etc.?
Not very well. And so I think we can expect some real issues coming from that. Where do companies draw the line when it comes to I want to serve my package. I'm Amazon. I want to serve my package to my customer and please our customer in 1 hour, but it's pouring outside or very windy. And that puts a lot of people on the way from my hub to the customer at risk, because if the drone falls out of the sky, it's going to crash through someone's house carrying a heavy package. Where do we draw that line? Weather is somewhat subjective, somewhat predictive. Can government step in and say, beyond a certain level of rain, beyond a certain wind level, you're not allowed to fly? That's not something that is clear cut even in the commercial aviation space. Airline companies will fly at any cost unless they think their investments in their aircraft are at risk, which is something that in the end comes down to their bottom line. So, and governments have to regulate that, right? So good question. It's something that won't be avoidable, and it has to be addressed in the next couple of years. Where do we draw the boundaries for these sorts of operations?
All right, there is another question. Most older people are unlikely to trust the latest delivery. Is there a way to compensate for that?
If I understand the question correctly, it's do we trust drones themselves being
safe? Yeah, I think
safe?
that the question means whether can drones provide safe delivery, and to what extent older people are likely to respond to them positively. It's an interesting question from the perspective that there's more and more older people in the world.
Yeah. If drones are used ubiquitously and people don't trust them, and so therefore deny the service, kind of like digital banking. Like if people don't trust digital banking, which is a fair concern, do they not have access to the existing services? In the case of banking, there are still ways to do banking without having to be on your phone or computer all the time. You can go into the bank branch and have all your things done by a real person, right? But when it comes to drones and you're in a rural area and you've never been served before, if you don't trust the drone, does that mean you don't get served at all? So that's a very poignant question, and it comes down to, you have to think about in all of these new technologies is what does the technology bring to society? If it has a net positive impact on the quality of life of your citizens, government should have the incentive, at least, to regulate it in such a way that companies have the incentive to keep that service alive. It's kind of like the government keeping alive a lot of the postal companies that we have around us that are loss making. They don't make money, but the governments realize that they're important for people to have a high quality of life, and therefore they pump money into it every year. Something similar logic applies to people who don't trust drones. Should they still have access to the normal services? And if so, what should governments do about it?
And this fits with this question is, to what extent will drones displace people's jobs?
That is probably the most important question, is the question of the future of work. Technologies are here to displace people. And that's something that people argue about all the time, is, are they creating more jobs? Are they taking away jobs? In our modeling efforts, in my research, the biggest impact that drones have for the bottom line of the company is to remove the person. They're the most costly part of the operation is the person driving the truck, because they spend a lot of time finding parking, they spend a lot of time having lunch, they spend a lot of time, these sorts of things. Now, that's obviously nothing we can stop, right? And that's something that we should be accepting of. But that's not something a company with revenue motivations cares about. So yes, these will displace lots of jobs, and these will displace particularly the drivers of Amazon, UPS, these sorts of people, which are often not employees of the company, but rather third-party people that Amazon hires, and therefore will be even more expendable, because to Amazon, they look like an external cost. on their balance sheet and income statements, which means that they have a direct incentive to reduce that number. Drones will get rid of people in the workplace, whether that means that it creates enough jobs on the other side for loading the goods on the drone, for testing the drone is still safe, for operating the drones as a fleet manager. I don't think those jobs will outweigh the jobs being taken away.
Fred, would you be so kind to ask the questions that you have?
Sure, Farri, I have two questions that came in earlier through email. So what are the most popular drones in deliveries fair? That's the first question. The second question is drone delivery technology anywhere close to ready for mass deployment?
Good questions. What is the most popular drone for drone delivery? The most common drone that we see in our day-to-day, not for drone delivery, for other use cases, is the tiny helicopter-like thing with 4 different propellers, and they are very maneuverable and they go around like that, and they have cameras under them. Those are the most common type of drone, but they're not the most efficient. And actually, they're the least efficient out of the options that we have. What we can expect to see for drone delivery are what they call fixed wing VTOL drones. And what that means is that drones can have fixed wings, kind of like an airplane. And so they fly very fast and they use their wings to generate the lift, not the propellers. But when they need to land and take off, they have propellers to do this vertical movement. That's what the VTOL stands for. And so that's the most common, that's what I expect drone delivery companies to be using. And these are safer than the other ones, the ones that we currently see, which are called quadcopters. But they are, they fly faster, but at the same time, they're technologies that are unproven. We've never had an aerial vehicle. I'm sure aeronautics people in the audience would attest. Like, we don't have many aircraft that can do both hover and fly forward. And so it's something that we're not going to be super confident about until regulations ensure that it's safe for us to use. The second question, could you remind me what that was, Fred? I think you're on mute, Fred.
Fred?
So is drone delivery technology anywhere close to ready for mass deployment?
Yes and no. Yes, the hardware is there. That fixed wing aircraft that I just mentioned, those things exist and there isn't going to be much change. Batteries, yes, they're almost there. They're pretty good already. They can do what we require. It'd be better if they're a bit better, but otherwise they're there. The thing that's still missing right now, in my personal opinion, is the computer vision. And what I mean by this is drones will have an onboard computer to capture the data, to operate their cameras, to receive commands from the operator. They will also have this computer to make decisions about what they should do if they see something ahead of them. If a drone sees a bird, it needs to be able to avoid it. If a drone is about to hit a building, it needs to be able to avoid it. And computer vision, basically the ability for the drone's computer to analyze its surroundings and say, that's a building, that's a tree, that's a bird, and we need to avoid these things. It's just not there yet. It's nearly there, but it's a huge undertaking that lots of researchers are spending time on. And they're not just spending time on it for drone delivery. They're doing it for autonomous cars. They're doing it for autonomous flight for commercial airlines. They're doing it for autonomous taxis, these sorts of things. So it's a huge field of research. And personally, I don't think the technology underpinning it, so machine learning and artificial intelligence, are that robust that we can promise and ensure that drones will always be safe in every instance. And so that's one of my main concerns, actually, is that regulators don't understand the underlying technology of machine learning AI that is not good enough to serve the needs of the safety expectations that we have. But companies cloud the understanding of regulators and society and say, this is an AI system that is super good and will always be safe. And we don't really know what's under the hood. And so that is definitely a risk that we run the risk of coming up against, is not understanding the technology well enough and not understanding the risks involved.
Fred, do you have any other questions? If you don't, I will have one. And then if you have one, do you have one?
Yes, I have another question that I was about to ask. So thank you, Farri. This is a question from Alex. Thank you very much for such insightful presentation. I find the potential of drone technology remarkably promising. I would be interested in hearing your thoughts about the transition period, specifically about non-FAA approved aerial vehicles being deployed in developing countries to collect flight data for later FAA certification. I would not be surprised if we see drones delivery in Mombasa before New York. So do you think it is acceptable to use LMICs as a test bench for these applications? So some of the acronyms, I don't really know what they mean, but maybe you explain that to the audience.
I get the gist. Thanks for the question.
That's from Alex Rosero, who was our intern.
Yes, I know him all too well. He always asks the toughest questions. So I don't know if you guys know. I think you make a very good point. When it comes to new technologies, lots of wealthy countries don't want to test it on their soil. They'd rather do it somewhere else. If something goes wrong, it's out of the view of society. This comes with, like, this always happens. So like in a commercial aircraft, if we've introduced a new technology, a new engine, for instance, it'll be put on a new commercial aircraft flying in regions that aren't very populated, so or third world countries, and probably delivering packages rather than people, right? Like we don't want to put people on an airplane with a new engine. In the same way, we can, Alex is right, like we can expect to see drones being used and tested in areas that aren't so strict on regulation, aren't so strict on safety, because if something does happen, they're not liable, and aren't so strict on the policies, the liability rules involved. And they're out of the purview of societies in the West, such that once the drone is ready, they can bring it over the drone technology, and no one will have a pretense of, oh, I saw that drone in Mombasa and it wasn't very safe, so I don't want it to be delivering something to my house. That's what they're trying to avoid. And that is definitely something they'll be doing. And they're currently doing it now. So Zipline is it's launched its operation in Rwanda. Yes, it's for a good cause of delivering blood to people who need it. And yes, it's been praised as a very good social experiment. But Zipline are now delivering packages for Walmart, and they knew that from the start. Google Wing is doing tests in rural Australia, and it's not a third world country, and it's not Mombasa, but it's definitely out of the purview of people until they want to migrate the technology over to the US. And so, yes, like we can expect to see, I mean, this will even happen even on US soil, is that we'll probably launch them in rural areas without much regulation before we do anything in New York City, right? And the main reason for that is, one, to protect safety, but two, protect the public image of the drone company operating the drone. And that's common across all technologies. And that does say something about the trust that these companies have in their technology.
There's a question here about what are the consequences of developing drone technology in developing countries?
The only issue that comes to mind for me is the fact that the US is now very defensive on drone technologies being built outside the US soil. And we've kind of seen that with DJI, which is the major drone manufacturer in China, produces 85% of the drones in the world. 85% market share is huge.
That's a big number.
And the US is very scared of that, because what if China or another actor who has access to Chinese blueprints can access drones being used in the US to deliver packages through some backdoor and breach some cybersecurity protocols. And as Dr. Durbak, you mentioned before, strap a bomb to a drone, make it look like a delivery drone, and put it into New York City within a fleet of Amazon drones that no one can realize this is not an Amazon drone. This is something, there's an inherent risk with having technologies being developed and built outside of the country they're being deployed, because you inherently trust the technology and whatever's under the hood, the safety of that. Now, lots of countries around the world, even where I am now in New Zealand, is a good example. We pay for expensive technologies, but we have no idea how they work. And we just assume that the people who made them, Germany, US, China, are well-meaning and they have safe, good protocols for cybersecurity, so on.
Well, you're being very optimistic. I am not so secure about every country having the morals or the ethics to protect the human race or others.
Absolutely, no, that's what I think lots of countries like New Zealand believe. I think the US, for instance, is aware that this is not something they should be assuming. So that's addressing the first question about developing drones in other countries. Using drones in developing countries, the risk, the only, I think the major key risk is that the regulations aren't there to protect against the issues I mentioned earlier. So safety, privacy, noise, what Dr. Durbak mentioned, like terrorism and the risk of people being malign actors and discrimination on service levels. These are all things that regulation has to address, because companies do not have the incentive to address this because these are against their underlying profit motivations. So developing countries need to have I guess one thing that people don't realize is that when regulation is initiated or created, it's created by a human being sitting in a governmental agency. Do these agencies in third world countries have the expertise to understand the cybersecurity risks of drones and someone being able to make a drone look like a delivery drone, but it's actually a terrorist drone? That's the concern I have. And so countries should really work together in developing standardized sharing information, standardized regulation and sharing information about the risks involved through bodies like the UN and these sorts of things, so that everyone's on equal playing field, so that other countries aren't left behind and suffer the consequences of technologies that the US has proposed. And so I think those are the risks involved with using drones in developing countries, is they suffer the bad consequences because they weren't made aware of the risks before they adopted the technology.
So actually what you're saying is that at this point, there's no international regulatory body that puts the drone technology into an area where it can be protective to the population and protective to all people. There's nothing available at this time?
There are guidelines through the UN, but there are no binding regulations. The main aviation regulators, the FAA and EASA in Europe, and some other ones across East Asia are independent bodies, and they work together, but they're not consistent. And so no.
So there's another question, interesting question. The situation in the Suez Canal and its effect on the world trade. Are they considering using drones? And I do not know.
That's a good question. Honestly, it's a super good question. The reason why is because drone delivery is not just in cities. And this is something that I expect we'll see in the next 20 years or so. There will be autonomous aircraft flying goods across the world in the next 20 years or so. Currently, our commercial aircraft are basically autonomous. The pilot doesn't do very much in our typical flight from New York to Boston, for instance. A couple of companies have already developed what they call cargo aircraft that are designed very differently to our normal passenger aircrafts, but are designed to carry lots of packages very efficiently. And they have no pilots, or they don't need pilots. What this means is that it reduces the cost of delivering goods across large distances like seas substantially. And these aircraft can be considered drones. Technically, they're autonomous aircraft, right? But not so different. What this comes to say about places like issues like the Suez Canal blockage is that yes, like they are a competing service to what we know today as maritime shipping and shipping of goods across large distances. And these are long trips, right, being served by these ships, and autonomous aircraft flying goods across China to the US or wherever around the world will definitely be faster, and it'll definitely be cheaper than what we currently pay for international shipping within a couple of days. And so obviously, I don't know if you guys have, in the last 6 months since we've been stuck in COVID, have realized that shipping is actually a huge business, and shipping something internationally within 5 days is a lot more expensive than 5 weeks. And the reason is that if you're doing it in 5 days, you need to be putting it on a plane. And that plane has a lot of safety restrictions, has 2 pilots, and it has, and it was a plane designed for passengers, not for cargo, and therefore it's not optimal. So what we can expect to see is a reduction in that cost. And yes, some goods being taken away from ships, being put on autonomous aircraft to be shipped around the world.
That's very interesting. Fred, I believe you have another question.
Yes, Farri, this is a very interesting question. Will governments establish a highway system to address the issues of accidents that may occur given the number of drones that may be flying in the same space, and also to prevent privacy concerns?
That's a great question, and that's exactly my research. So yes and no, because it's very inefficient from the operator's perspective to have to follow highways. Because if that's the case, then why don't we just drive on the road? Because the road is the same distances as a typical highway, right? So the reason why drones are more cost effective and more sustainable is that they fly over everything in a straight line between A to B. And that reduces the distances, that reduces the times. That's really quite efficient for service. Now, if we allow drones to do that, A to B across the whole of the city, we're going to have a huge mess, a jumble of drones flying above our heads. And so some form of highway does make sense, right? And that's what is intuitive for people. Governments have the right to do that, and they very, very well may do that if they deem it necessary. For instance, in New York, you're not going to have drones flying over these buildings. You're probably going to have them flying through the building, if at all. But these are going to be specific routes that the drones have to follow. Somewhere like LA, where there are not that many buildings, they may be able to fly with fewer highway restrictions. So whilst it depends on the city and the regulators of that city, this is a decision that governments have to make. Now, there are lots of other decisions that come into this sort of safety, this approach to safe operations for drones. One would be the highway operation. So defining specific corridors that drones can fly. And within those, defining altitudes. So if you're going somewhere, you fly above. If you're coming back, you fly below. And that way you don't crash into one another. There are other things that we can do, like defining geofences around certain things that we don't want people flying over. So rather than having a highway where drones must fly in this corridor, have areas where drones cannot fly, and otherwise they can do whatever they want. So no flying above university campuses, no flying above schools, no flying above hospitals. And we can draw fences on the map, and drones can, with their GPS, can know, oh, this is a virtual fence. I'm not allowed to go through, I have to go around. There are things like this that are being employed. There are also other like interesting ideas that are safety related, but very different to what you just mentioned. One is, let's only allow drones to fly when we know the population on the ground and the area it's flying over is at a minimum. And we know how populations move in a city. We know that people commute from the suburbs into the city and they go back out and they follow specific routes, the roads. So why don't we design drones to only deliver goods or fly when there are as few people possible in the area that they're going to? So for instance, we know there's a sports game on in the stadium and all the area around, lots of people are walking to the stadium, lots of people are parking. Let's not fly drones in there from 6 to 9 p.m. today. And that's something the governments can say and set. So there are sort of innovative ways to do this. The scary thing about all of this is that governments may not have the capacity or the expertise to do such a thing. And lots of private companies are stepping in and saying, give the contract to us, we'll do it for you. Do we trust those sorts of operators? Do they have the capabilities to think about all these things? I don't know. But that is something to be aware of, is that private companies are now pushing their way into air traffic control for drone delivery. And that's something that government needs to be aware of, and society should be aware of before they say, yes, drones can fly in my city.
That leads me to another question, Farri. How high and how far can drones fly?
Very high and very far. Like, I think the higher this, it's not necessarily a direct correlation, but technically the higher, the less impactful on society, because you don't really hear them, you don't see them. And if they're high enough and they do fall out of the sky, they may have opportunities to deploy a parachute or glide to somewhere else away from populations. If they're too close, there's little time before it falls and it hits someone. And so in some ways, the higher the better, right? How high can they fly? As high as the battery permits them. So it's very energy intensive, as engineers know, to fly vertically. Helicopters are much less efficient than aircraft, for instance. And so in that sense, companies won't have an incentive to fly high. They want to fly as low as possible. How far can they fly? Also dependent on the energy of the battery. And it depends on the demand set or the demand space that they're trying to serve. If drones don't need to fly very far, it's cheaper to fit a smaller, less costly battery on that drone. But those are very much dependent on the drone design and the battery design.
The next question is, what does it mean for society? Do you think that eventually drones will displace the traditional means of warfare? And how would this affect society, particularly in areas where war is insidious?
Prevalent. Yeah.
Interesting.
Good question. I don't think it'll completely change the warfare landscape, but we've seen a huge shift in how war is performed since the 1940s, right? Like we don't have standing armies in the way that we used to, and we won't have the direct contact that we used to. Everything has been detached and digitized and made more remote than in the past. Drones are just another tool in that endeavor. And so in many ways, drones aren't the most potent of weapons. They're not going to carry massive artillery guns. They're not going to carry huge explosives. They're just going to be small, like a smaller weapon of use, but also mainly for data gathering. And data gathering, I mean basically taking pictures and taking films and figuring out where people are and where deposits are, where warehouses are, where people are standing, where the enemy is. And so in that way, yes, drones will be, I suspect drones will make warfare much more targeted, in the sense that we have surveillance airplanes now taking pictures and telling us this is where we need to attack and why. Drones will be like that, but closer to the ground. And so I can expect they won't revolutionize war. They will make war less, lack for a better word, personable. Like there'll be less direct contact in war, and it'll be a lot more targeted because of the data that drones can provide.
Well, Farri, thank you for a very, very interesting and informative presentation. I know that you have given a lot of food for thought to all the listeners, and we look forward to your next presentation on another fascinating topic, which hopefully you'll be able to present in May.
Yeah, so, I hope so.
Have a wonderful day. And again, thank you very much. It was just fascinating learning about something that most of us know very little about. Have a good day.
Thanks so much, Dr. Durbak. Thank you very much. And thanks everyone for joining. See you soon.
Thank you, Rosella.